The voice cut through the ceremony like a blade. "You there, in the back. What exactly do you think you are doing?" Captain Raymond Sloan had spotted the disturbance from 30 rows away, and now every head in the Naval Station Norfolk Auditorium turned to follow his pointing finger toward the last row of seats, toward the old man sitting alone in the shadows near the exit door, toward the tears streaming silently down a face weathered by decades of wind and salt and something far heavier than weather. The old man did not move. His hands, scarred and calloused in ways that suggested work most people could not imagine, remained still in his lap. One hand rested over something beneath his torn jacket, something he touched the way a man touches a rosary or a photograph or the last physical proof that his life had once meant something. What Captain Sloan did not know, what nobody in that auditorium filled with dress whites and polished metals and 4 decades of distinguished service knew, was that in exactly 15 minutes, he would wish he had never opened his mouth. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, drop a comment below telling us where you're joining us from. Stories of hidden heroes like this one happen in every community, maybe even yours. Now, let us continue. The ceremony had been flawless until this moment. Rear Admiral Catherine Holt sat in the place of honor at the front of the auditorium, her silver hair perfectly styled beneath her cover, her uniform bearing the weight of 40 years of service. This was her day, her retirement, her moment to receive the gratitude of the institution she had given her life to. And Captain Sloan, as chief of protocol, had spent 3 months ensuring that every detail would reflect the dignity she deserved. He had not planned for the vagrant in the back row. Sloan moved down the center aisle with the precision of a man who understood that appearance was everything. 2 security personnel fell into step behind him, their presence a statement of authority. The auditorium held perhaps 300 people, and every single one of them was watching now. The ceremony had stopped. Admiral Holt had paused mid-sentence at the podium. Even Fleet Admiral Marcus Gentry, the keynote speaker seated in the front row, had turned to observe the confrontation. The old man still did not move. He sat with a stillness that seemed out of place, a composure that did not match his torn jacket or his unwashed hair or the clothes that marked him as homeless. His posture, despite everything, was straight, not the practiced straightness of someone trying to appear dignified. The unconscious straightness of someone for whom proper posture had become muscle memory decades ago. "Sir." Sloan stopped 3 rows from the back, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "I'm going to have to ask you to explain yourself. This is a formal military ceremony. Invitation only, and I do not recall seeing your name on my list." The old man finally looked up. His eyes were red from crying, but they held something that made Sloan hesitate for just a fraction of a second. Something steady, something that had seen things Sloan could not imagine. But the hesitation passed, because Raymond Sloan had not risen to captain by allowing himself to be intimidated by vagrants. "I apologize for the disruption, sir." The old man's voice was quiet, hoarse from disuse, but there was no tremor in it. "I meant no disrespect. I will leave." He began to rise, slowly, his joints protesting in the way of a body that had been pushed far beyond its limits for far too long. But Sloan held up a hand. "Not so fast. You do not simply walk into a naval ceremony uninvited, disrupt proceedings with whatever emotional display this is, and then shuffle off without explanation." He turned slightly, ensuring his voice would carry to the watching crowd. "This is exactly the kind of security breach that makes our institution look foolish." Someone in the middle rose, shifted uncomfortably. A woman near the front leaned over to whisper something to her husband. But no one spoke up. No one intervened. Because Captain Sloan had rank, and rank had power, and power in this room meant the authority to humiliate a homeless man in front of 300 witnesses. The old man stood fully now. He was tall, or had been once. Age and hardship had curved his spine slightly, stolen inches from his frame. But there was something in the way he held himself, something in the economy of his movements, the placement of his feet, the angle of his shoulders, something that whispered of training so deeply ingrained it could never be fully erased. "I was not aware I needed an invitation, sir," he said quietly. This is a public ceremony. I saw the notice in the paper. Public ceremony. Sloan let out a sharp laugh. Look at yourself. Do you really think you belong here? Among these people? Among officers who have actually served? There it was. The accusation beneath the confrontation. The assumption that a man who looked like this could not possibly have any legitimate connection to the Navy. That poverty meant fraud. That homelessness meant dishonor. The old man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His hand moved to touch the fabric over his chest again, and for just a moment, something clinked beneath his jacket. Metal against metal. A sound that several people in the nearby rows recognized instinctively. Sir, he said, and his voice remained steady despite everything I served. I have every right to be here. You served. Sloan stepped closer, emboldened by the silence of the crowd, by his own authority, by the absolute certainty that he was in the right. Then where is your uniform? Where are your medals? Where is your invitation from someone who can verify that you are not just another stolen valor case looking for attention? The old man's red-rimmed eyes met Sloan's. There was no anger in them, no defensiveness, only a grief so profound that it seemed to have its own gravity. My service, he said quietly, is not the kind that came with medals. 3 rows away, a man in civilian clothes sat up straighter. He was perhaps 60 years old, wearing a VFW pin on his lapel. He was studying the homeless man's posture, his bearing, the particular way he stood when addressed by someone of rank. And something about what he was seeing made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. At the front of the auditorium, Admiral Catherine Holt had abandoned her speech entirely. She was watching the confrontation with an expression that no one could quite read. Her aide touched her arm, whispering that they should continue, that Sloan would handle it. But Holt did not move. Her eyes were fixed on the old man in the back row, on the way he held himself, on the hand pressed over his chest, on the tears that had not stopped streaming down his face even as he defended his right to be there. I'm going to ask you one more time, Sloan said, his voice dropping to something cold and final. Why are you here? Why are you crying? And why should I not have security escort you out of this building right now? The old man was silent for a long moment. His fingers moved beneath his jacket, touching whatever lay hidden there. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I am here, he said, because 40 years ago, I made a promise to someone. And I am crying because the woman at that podium is alive. And I never knew she made it. The words hung in the air like smoke. Captain Sloan opened his mouth to respond, to dismiss this as the ramblings of a mentally ill vagrant, to order security to remove this disruption from his perfect ceremony. But before he could speak, Admiral Catherine Holt stepped away from the podium and began walking toward the back of the auditorium. And everything that Captain Raymond Sloan thought he knew about this moment was about to shatter completely. The water had been black, not dark, not murky, black in the way that only the deep ocean can be black, where light itself surrenders and the pressure becomes a living thing that wraps around your chest and whispers that you do not belong here, that nothing human belongs here, that the 800 meters between you and the surface might as well be 800 miles. Elias Yarrow remembered the cold most of all, the way it seeped through the diving suit and into his bones and settled there like a permanent resident. April in the North Atlantic was not forgiving. April at 800 meters was something else entirely, something that tested the boundary between survival and suicide. The call had come at 0347. USS Scepter, position 41.7325 north, 49.9469 west. Hull breach. 52 souls aboard. Sinking. He had been 32 years old. Master Chief, Petty Officer. Rescue Diver, First Class. The kind of man they sent when a mission was impossible and failure meant families who would never see their loved ones again. He had done the math during the helicopter ride to the support vessel. 800 meters. 52 people. Limited air supply on both ends. The numbers did not add up to success. The numbers added up to choosing who lived and who died. Warren Albright had been beside him on that helicopter. Chief Petty Officer. Best diver Elias had ever worked with. Best friend he had ever had. Warren had been cracking jokes about the cold, about the depth, about how their wives were going to kill them for volunteering for another suicide mission. That was how Warren handled fear. He made it funny. He made everything funny until suddenly it was not. The memory fractured, and Elias was back in the Norfolk auditorium, standing in the aisle with Captain Sloane's contempt washing over him and 300 pairs of eyes burning into his skin. But the fracture was incomplete. Part of him was still in 1983. Part of him would always be in 1983. He watched Admiral Holt walking toward him, and he saw her face as it had been 40 years ago. Younger, unconscious, blue-lipped, and not breathing when he had pulled her through the breach in the Scepter's hull. She had been the 39th extraction. He remembered because he had been counting, because counting was the only way to keep the panic at bay. 39, 40, 41, each number a life. Each life a reason to keep diving back into that black water. She had coughed up seawater in his arms. Her eyes had opened for just a moment, unfocused and terrified, and then she had passed out again. He had passed her to Warren at the decompression station and gone back down. Because there were still people in that submarine. Because the mission was not finished. Because giving up was not something Elias Yarrow knew how to do. 47. They had saved 47. 5 had been beyond saving by the time the divers reached them. Equipment failure, the official report would say. The official report that was immediately classified. The official report that would be sealed so thoroughly that even the families would never know what really happened to their loved ones in those black waters. And Warren. Warren had stayed in the decompression chamber too long, waiting for Elias to surface from the final dive. The chamber had malfunctioned on the decompression cycle. Something about the pressure seals. Something about the equipment being pushed beyond its limits. Warren's lungs had collapsed before Elias could reach him. Before anyone could reach him. His last words had come through the radio. Broken. Vet. Barely human. Get them home. Elias had carried those words for 40 years. He had carried them through the debriefing where men in suits told him that this mission had never happened, that he was never to speak of it, that the 47 sailors they had saved would never know who had pulled them from the darkness. He had carried them through his discharge, quiet and unceremonious, his service record scrubbed of anything that might hint at what he had done. He had carried them through 20 years of marriage to Nora, through the birth of his daughter Sarah, through the slow construction of a life that felt borrowed, like he was living on time that should have belonged to Warren. And then Nora had gotten sick. The memory shifted again, and he was standing in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and defeat. 8 years ago, Nora's hand in his, her fingers so thin he was afraid they would break. Sarah had been in the hallway, talking to doctors, trying to find solutions that did not exist. And Nora had looked at him with eyes that still held the spark of the woman he had fallen in love with 30 years before. You have to stay, she had whispered. For Sarah. Promise me. He had promised. He had held her hand while the machines beeped and then stopped beeping. He had stood beside his daughter at the funeral, while people said things that were supposed to be comforting and were not. He had tried. God, he had tried. But every time he looked at Sarah, he saw Nora. Every time he heard her laugh, he heard his wife. And the weight of it, combined with the weight of Warren and the weight of 47 souls who did not know his name and the weight of 5 who had died beyond his reach, had become too much. He had left a note on the kitchen table. I love you. I am sorry. Live your life. Do not look for me. And then he had walked out the door and kept walking until Elias Yarrow, the man he had been, disappeared entirely. 6 years. 6 years of shelters and street corners and naval towns where he could sit outside bases and watch the uniforms come and go and remember what it had felt like to belong to something larger than himself. 6 years of following his daughter's career from the shadows, watching her graduate from the academy, watching her pin on lieutenant bars, then lieutenant commander, watching her become everything he and Nora had dreamed she would become. He had been at her wedding, standing behind a tree at the edge of the venue, close enough to see her smile, close enough to hear her laugh, too broken to let her see what her father had become. The photograph in his jacket pocket was from her commissioning ceremony. He had found it in a newspaper, cut it out, laminated it with packing tape from a shelter supply closet. Her face smiled up at him every night before he closed his eyes. His little girl in her dress whites. His little girl who had become a naval officer despite having a father who had abandoned her. And now Admiral Catherine Holt was walking toward him, and the past was colliding with the present in ways he could not control. Captain Sloane was saying something, demanding something, but Elias could not hear him anymore. He could only see the woman approaching. The 39th extraction. The young ensign who had coughed up seawater in his arms 40 years ago in water so black that light itself had surrendered. She was alive. She had lived a whole life. She had risen to Admiral. She had made something of the breath he had given back to her. And Elias Yarrow, standing in his torn jacket with tears streaming down his face, felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for 4 decades. The mission was never supposed to matter. The Navy had made sure of that. But standing here, watching proof of what they had accomplished walking toward him in dress whites and silver stars, Elias realized that it had always mattered. Every single dive into that darkness had mattered. Warren's death had mattered, and the 47 souls they had carried back to the surface, including the woman now close enough for him to see the confusion and the recognition beginning to war in her eyes, had mattered more than anything the Navy had ever tried to erase. Captain Sloane stepped directly into Admiral Holt's path. With respect, Admiral, please allow security to handle this. This is exactly the kind of disruption we trained for. I will have him removed, and we can continue with your ceremony. Holt did not slow down. She did not even acknowledge that Sloane had spoken. Her eyes remained fixed on the old man, standing in the aisle, on the tears still tracking down his weathered face, on the hand pressed against his chest, where something lay hidden beneath his torn jacket. Admiral. Sloane's voice carried an edge now. The edge of a man who was losing control of a situation he had been certain he controlled. I must insist. This individual is clearly unstable. He has made claims about knowing you, about some kind of service connection. It is almost certainly stolen valor or mental illness, or both. The old man flinched at the words. Stolen valor. 2 words that carried the weight of accusation, of fraud, of dishonoring every man and woman who had ever worn the uniform legitimately. 2 words that had been weaponized against homeless veterans so many times that they had become a reflex for people like Sloane. See someone who looks broken. Assume they're lying about their service. It was easier than considering the alternative. The man with the VFW pin 3 rows away stood up. His name was Gerald Fitch, and he had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a Navy corpsman. He had seen enough broken men to recognize the real thing when it stood in front of him. And everything about the homeless man in the aisle, from his bearing to his stillness to the particular way grief sat on his shoulders, told Gerald that whatever this man was, he was not a fraud. Captain. Gerald's voice was calm but firm. I think you might want to reconsider your approach here. Sloane turned, irritation flashing across his face. This is a security matter, sir. Please remain seated. Gerald did not sit. He took a step into the aisle instead, positioning himself between Sloane and the old man. I spent 30 years working with veterans, Captain. I have seen stolen valor. I have seen mental illness. And I have seen men who carried things so heavy that the weight broke them in ways that do not show on the outside. He nodded toward the homeless man. That man served. I would stake my life on it. Sloane's jaw tightened. And I would stake my career on the fact that he wandered in off the street, looking for attention. He pushed past Gerald and grabbed the old man's arm. Now you're going to come with security, and we're going to sort this out away from the ceremony you have already disrupted. The movement was fast. So fast that most people in the auditorium did not see exactly what happened. Sloane grabbed the arm. The old man shifted his weight. And suddenly Sloane was off balance, his grip broken. His body rotated 45 degrees without any apparent effort from a man he had been trying to manhandle. The old man released him immediately. Step back, raised both hands in a gesture of surrender. I apologize, he said quietly. Reflex. But the damage was done. Sloane's face had gone red with humiliation. 300 people had just watched a homeless vagrant make the chief of protocol look like a clumsy child. And worse, far worse, the movement that had accomplished it was not the flailing of an unstable mind. It was precise, controlled, the kind of technique that took years to master and more years to make instinctive. Gerald Fitch smiled grimly. Told you, he said to no one in particular. Admiral Holt had stopped a few feet away, watching the exchange with an expression that had shifted from confusion to something else. Something that looked almost like hope, or fear, or both tangled together in ways that defied separation. Your arm, she said quietly. The old man looked at her. Show me your arm. Sloane sputtered. Admiral, I really must protest. This man just assaulted me. We should be calling the military police, not entertaining his delusions. Captain Sloane. Holt's voice carried the weight of 40 years of command. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. Every person in that auditorium heard it, felt it, understood that something fundamental had shifted in the power dynamics of the room. Be quiet. Sloane's mouth opened. Closed. Open again. No sound came out. The old man looked at Holt for a long moment. His hand moved to his sleeve. He began to roll it up slowly, revealing skin that was weathered and spotted with age, revealing scars that told stories most people could not read, and revealing, on his inner forearm, a tattoo that had faded with decades but remained legible. Numbers, coordinates, a date, and below them, 2 letters inside a small anchor. 41.7325 N. 49.9469 W. April 17, 1983. Vedu, ah. Holt made a sound. It was not a word. It was not a gasp. It was something more primal than either. The sound of a memory breaking through walls that had been built over 40 years. She knew those coordinates. She had dreamed of those coordinates. They had appeared in her nightmares for decades. The last thing she remembered before the black water had closed over her head and stolen her consciousness. The position of the USS Scepter when it went down. The position where 52 sailors had waited to die and 47 had been pulled back from the edge by divers whose names she had never been allowed to know. At the front of the auditorium, Fleet Admiral Marcus Gentry had risen from his seat. His face had gone pale. He was old enough to remember 1983. Old enough to remember the classified briefings. Old enough to know exactly what those coordinates meant and why the mission attached to them had been erased from every official record. Where did you get that tattoo? Sloane's voice had changed. The contempt was still there, but something else had crept in underneath it. Something that sounded almost like desperation. You could have found those numbers anywhere. You could have researched the coordinates and had them inked on your arm to support whatever story you have constructed. The old man looked at Sloane with eyes that held no anger. Only exhaustion. Only the weight of carrying a truth that no one had ever been allowed to hear. I got this tattoo, he said quietly, in a hospital in Reykjavik 3 days after I watched my best friend die in a decompression chamber because he waited too long for me to surface. His initials are the WA. Warren Albright, Chief Petty Officer, the finest diver I ever knew. He paused. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. He told me to get them home. So I did. 47 of them, including a young ensign who was not breathing when I pulled her through the breach, who coughed up seawater in my arms before I passed her to Warren and went back down for the others. He looked at Admiral Holt, and she looked back at him with tears now streaming down her own face. The room had gone absolutely silent. 300 people holding their breath, waiting, sensing that something was about to break open that could never be closed again. You, Holt whispered. It was you. The old man nodded slowly. My name is Elias Yarrow, he said. Master Chief Petty Officer. Rescue Diver, First Class. Call sign Depth Charge. And I have waited 40 years to know if the 39th soul I carried out of that submarine survived. Behind them, Fleet Admiral Gentry was already moving. His aide was on the phone. Security personnel were receiving new orders. Because what was about to happen in this auditorium could not happen in front of 300 witnesses without the proper clearances. The ceremony was over. Something far more important had just begun. The helicopter had been loud. Elias remembered that. The rotor washed, drowning out everything except the pounding of his own heart and the sound of Warren checking equipment beside him. They had done this before, dozens of times, but never at this depth, never with this many lives hanging in the balance, never with numbers that screamed impossibility no matter how many ways you calculated them. "You know what I love about you, Yarrow?" Warren had shouted over the noise, his grin visible even through the diving mask pushed up on his forehead. "You never learned how to quit. Most guys, they see 800 meters and 52 souls, and they start making excuses. You just start making plans." Elias had not answered. He had been running the math again. Dive time, decompression requirements, air supply on the Scepter, air supply in their own tanks. The numbers kept coming up wrong. The numbers kept telling him that some of those 52 people were going to die no matter what he did. Warren had seen it in his face. "Hey." His friend's hand had gripped his shoulder. "We save who we can. That is the job. We do not play God. We just do the work and let the numbers fall where they fall." "Easy for you to say," Elias had replied. "You actually believe in God." Warren had laughed. "That is why I am the optimist, and you are the guy who makes the plans. Now tell me the plan, depth charge. Tell me how we're going to pull off the impossible one more time." The plan had been simple, brutal. One diver goes down through the breach. One diver stays at the decompression station to manage the ascents. They would rotate, but Elias would take the first dive because he was faster in the water, and speed meant lives when the air was running out 800 meters below the surface. The descent had taken 11 minutes. 11 minutes of blackness closing in around him. 11 minutes of pressure building against his skull and his chest and every joint in his body. 11 minutes of knowing that 52 people were suffocating in a metal coffin at the bottom of the ocean, and he was their only chance. The Scepter had been worse than the briefing suggested. The hull breach was larger than reported. The submarine had come to rest at an angle against a subsurface geological formation, which meant the escape routes were compromised, which meant he would have to go deeper into the wreckage to reach the survivors, which meant the numbers had just gotten worse. He had found them in the forward compartments, huddled together in the darkness, some conscious, some not, all of them running out of time. The first extraction had been a young seaman, barely 20 years old, eyes wide with terror in the beam of Elias's dive light. Elias had fitted him with emergency breathing apparatus, guided him through the breach, sent him ascending toward Warren and the decompression station. Then he had gone back down, again and again. And again, the faces blurred together after the first dozen. The 39th extraction was the one he remembered most clearly. Not because she was special, not because he knew she would one day become an admiral, but because she had stopped breathing. He had found her pinned beneath debris in a flooding compartment, unconscious, lips blue, no pulse that he could detect through his gloves. Protocol said to move on. Protocol said to prioritize the living over the likely dead. But Elias had never been good at following protocol when lives were on the line. He had freed her, fitted her with apparatus, carried her through the breach himself because she was too far gone to swim. And somewhere in that ascent, somewhere in the hellish journey from 800 meters to the decompression station, she had coughed. Water had expelled from her lungs. Her heart had started again. Warren had taken her from his arms at the station. His friend's eyes had been shining with something that might have been tears or might have been the pressure. "Go," Warren had said. "There are more. I have got her. Go." So Elias had gone. Back into the black. Back into the cold. Back into the crushing weight of water that wanted nothing more than to add him to its collection of the dead. 40, 41, 42. The submarine had groaned around him on the 43rd extraction. Metal shifting, structure failing. He had known then that he was running out of time in ways that went beyond air supply. 44, 45, 46, 47. The 48th compartment had been flooded completely. 5 bodies, 5 sailors who had drowned before he could reach them. 5 faces that would join the collection of ghosts he carried everywhere he went. He had surfaced for the last time with lungs burning and muscles screaming and the knowledge that he had done everything humanly possible. That 47 people were alive because of what he and Warren had accomplished in those 8 impossible hours. Warren had been waiting in the decompression chamber, grinning despite the exhaustion, despite the fact that he had been managing decompressions for 8 hours straight, pushing the equipment beyond its designed limits, pushing himself beyond every reasonable boundary. 47, Warren had said. Not bad for a couple of guys who never learned how to quit. The decompression cycle should have taken 4 hours. Standard protocol. But the equipment had been stressed. The seals had been compromised. And somewhere an hour or two, something had failed. Elias had heard the alarm from outside the chamber, had seen Warren's face change through the porthole, had watched his best friend realize what was happening in a half-second before his lungs collapsed from the pressure differential. He had tried to open the chamber, had burned his hands on controls that were locked by safety protocols designed to prevent exactly what was happening, had screamed Warren's name until his voice gave out. Warren's hand had pressed against the glass. His lips had moved. No sound could escape the chamber, but Elias had read the words anyway. Get them home. Then the hand had slid down the glass, and Warren Albright, the finest diver Elias had ever known, had died 3 feet away while Elias watched and could do nothing. The Navy had arrived 12 hours later. Men in suits, men with classifications and clearances and cold eyes that saw everything in terms of national security and acceptable losses. The mission never happened, they had told him. The Scepter experienced equipment failure. 5 crew members were lost. The rest were rescued by standard naval response. You were never here. Chief Petty Officer Albright died in a training accident stateside. His family will be notified accordingly. Elias had wanted to fight, had wanted to scream the truth until someone listened. But they had shown him what fighting would cost. Dishonorable discharge, criminal charges for revealing classified information, the destruction of everything he had worked for. So he had stayed quiet, had accepted the medical discharge, had carried the truth like a stone in his chest for 40 years while the Navy pretended that the most heroic rescue in its modern history had never occurred. And now he stood in an auditorium in Norfolk, looking at a woman whose life he had saved, and the stone was finally beginning to crack. Fleet Admiral Marcus Gentry reached the back of the auditorium with the measured pace of a man who had commanded fleets and made decisions that shaped history. His aide walked 2 steps behind, phone pressed to ear, speaking rapidly in the clipped language of someone accessing channels that did not officially exist. Everyone without TS/SCI clearance needs to leave this auditorium, Gentry announced. His voice carried the authority of 4 stars and 45 years of service. This is not a request. Security will escort you to the reception hall. The ceremony will resume shortly. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. 300 people exchanging confused glances, wondering what they had just witnessed, wondering why a retirement ceremony had suddenly become a classified event. But no one argued. Not with a fleet admiral. Not with that tone. Captain Sloan stepped forward. Admiral Gentry, sir, I can explain. This individual disrupted the ceremony, and I was simply attempting to maintain order. Whatever claims he is making, I assure you they require verification before we take any drastic measures. Gentry looked at Sloan the way a man looks at an insect that has landed on his dinner plate. Captain, your handling of this situation has been noted. Now step aside and let the adults manage what happens next. The color drained from Sloan's face. In 30 years of naval service, no one had ever spoken to him like that in front of subordinates, in front of anyone. He opened his mouth to protest, thought better of it, and stepped back with his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. The auditorium began to empty. Security personnel guided the confused guests toward the exits with polite efficiency. Gerald Fitch, the Vietnam veteran with the VFW pin, caught Elias's eye as he passed. He nodded once, a small gesture of recognition, of respect. Then he was gone with the others. Within 5 minutes, the vast space that had held 300 people contained fewer than 20. Admiral Holt, Fleet Admiral Gentry, a handful of senior officers whose clearances went high enough to hear what was about to be said, security personnel at the doors, and one figure who had remained motionless near the side wall throughout the evacuation. Lieutenant Commander Surya Yerochin had not moved when the clearance announcement came. Her TS/SCI access, earned through years in naval intelligence, gave her every right to remain. But that was not why she had stayed. She had stayed because she could not breathe, could not think, could not process what her eyes were telling her about the homeless man standing in the center aisle with tears on his face and coordinates tattooed on his arm. Her father, the man she had searched for across 6 years and 1,000 dead ends. The man whose note she still kept in her desk drawer, its edges worn soft from being unfolded and read and refolded 100 times. The man she had convinced herself was dead because the alternative, that he was alive and choosing not to come home, had been too painful to carry. He was here, alive, standing 20 feet away, and he had not seen her yet. Gentry was speaking again. Master Chief Yarrow, I need you to understand the position we are in. What you have revealed today touches on operations that remain classified at the highest levels. Operations that, officially, never occurred. I'm aware of that, sir. Elias's voice was steady despite everything. I have been aware of it for 40 years. Then you understand why I need to verify your claims before we proceed. Gentry's tone was not unkind, but it carried the weight of responsibility, of a man who had spent his career protecting secrets that could shake nations. Anyone could research those coordinates. Anyone could fabricate a story. Admiral Holt stepped forward. Marcus. Her use of his first name spoke to decades of shared service, shared trust. I was there. I was on the scepter when it went down. I was unconscious when they pulled me out. I never saw the faces of the men who saved us, but I remember the water in my lungs. I remember coughing it up in someone's arms. I remember a voice telling someone named Warren that he had me to go back down for the others. Elias closed his eyes, the memory washing over him again, the weight of her in his arms. The relief when she had coughed. Warren's voice telling him to go. I remember waking up in a hospital in Iceland. Holt continued. I remember men in suits telling me that I had been rescued by standard naval response, that I was never to discuss the details of what happened, that the 5 sailors who died were victims of equipment failure, not a classified mission gone wrong. She paused. I have spent 40 years wondering about the men who pulled us out of that submarine. 40 years wondering if they knew that they saved my life. 40 years living with the weight of a debt I could never repay because I did not know who to repay it to. She turned to face Elias fully. Now you are telling me that you were one of those men, that you carried me through that breach, that your friend died in the decompression chamber because he stayed too long waiting for you to surface. Yes, ma'am, Elias said quietly. Then tell me something that was not in any report. Tell me something that only someone who was actually there could know. The auditorium fell silent. Every eye focused on the old man in the torn jacket. Every breath held, waiting. Elias was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. When I found you, you were pinned under a fallen beam in compartment 7. Flooding was at chest level and rising. Your left arm was broken. The bone was visible through the skin. I had to set it before I could move you, because the angle would have caught on the debris during extraction. Holt's hand moved involuntarily to her left forearm. Beneath her uniform sleeve, a scar ran from elbow to wrist. A scar she had been told came from impact during the initial accident. A scar no official report had ever accurately explained. You were wearing a gold chain with a small cross, Elias continued. It had gotten tangled in your hair. I almost left it, but something told me it mattered. So I untangled it and made sure it stayed around your neck during the ascent. Holt's other hand moved to her throat. Beneath her uniform, against her skin, she wore a gold chain with a small cross. The same chain, the same cross. The one her grandmother had given her before her first deployment. The one she had been certain was lost in the accident until she woke up in Iceland and found it still around her neck. Her knees buckled. Gentry caught her arm, steadied her. But her eyes never left Elias. It was you, she whispered. My God, it was really you. From her position against the wall, Sarah Yarrow-chun pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle the sound that wanted to escape. Her father, the homeless man she had grieved as dead, the ghost she had chased across 6 years of false leads and abandoned hope. He was a hero. He had always been a hero, and she had never known. The silence that followed Holt's recognition was the kind that has weight. The kind that presses against eardrums and settles into bones. 20 people in a room designed for 300, and not one of them seemed capable of drawing breath. Fleet Admiral Gentry was the first to speak. His voice had changed. The command authority remained, but something else had crept in underneath. Something that sounded almost like reverence. Master Chief Yarrow. He stepped closer, studying Elias with eyes that had seen decades of service and sacrifice. I was a commander in 1983. I sat on the review board that classified the Scepter incident. I saw the dive logs. I saw the extraction counts. I saw the recommendation for the Navy Cross that was filed and then buried so deep it might as well have never existed. Elias said nothing. His hand had moved again to the space beneath his jacket where the dog tags lay against his chest. 2 sets of tags. 2 identities. One still living. One 40 years dead. I argued against the classification. Gentry continued. I told them that what those divers accomplished deserved recognition. That burying it would be a betrayal of everything the Navy claimed to stand for. He paused. I was overruled. National security concerns. Intelligence implications. The usual justifications for erasing inconvenient heroism. You were doing your job, sir. Elias's voice held no accusation. No bitterness. Only the flat acceptance of a man who had long ago made peace with institutional betrayal. Everyone was doing their job. No. Gentry shook his head. I was protecting my career. There is a difference. I could have pushed harder. I could have made noise. I chose not to, and I have carried that choice for 40 years. He straightened, squaring his shoulders as if preparing to receive a blow. I owe you an apology, Master Chief. The Navy owes you an apology. And today, in whatever capacity I can manage, I intend to begin making that right. Admiral Holt had recovered enough to stand without support, though her face remained pale and her eyes remained fixed on Elias with an intensity that seemed almost painful. The cross, she said quietly. You saved my grandmother's cross. I thought I had lost it in the flooding. I thought it was gone forever. And then I woke up, and it was still there, and I never understood how. You were holding it, Elias replied. When I found you, your hand was closed around it, so tight, I had to pry your fingers open to check for a pulse. He paused. It seemed important. Things like that usually are. Holt made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. I have worn it every day since. Every single day for 40 years. Because I thought it was a miracle. I thought God had preserved it somehow. She pressed her hand against her chest where the cross lay hidden. It was not God. It was you. From her position against the wall, Sarah watched the exchange with tears streaming silently down her face. She had spent 6 years imagining what her father had become. A broken man, a lost soul, someone who had given up on life and wandered into the darkness of homelessness and despair. She had prepared herself for the possibility that he was dead, had steeled herself against the likelihood that she would never see him again. She had not prepared for this, for the revelation that her father was not broken but buried, that his silence was not abandonment but classification, that the man who had walked out of her life without explanation had been carrying a weight so heavy that it had crushed him slowly over 4 decades. Captain Sloan stood at the edge of the remaining group, his face cycling through emotions he could not seem to control. Disbelief, shame, the dawning horror of a man realizing that he had publicly humiliated a genuine hero, that his contempt had been aimed at someone who had accomplished more in one night than Sloan would accomplish in his entire career. He stepped forward, his voice unsteady. Master Chief Yarrow, I need to. He stopped, started again. What I said earlier, the accusations. I did not know. You did not ask, Gerald Fitch's voice cut in. The Vietnam veteran had somehow remained in the auditorium despite the clearance order, his VFW pin apparently serving as sufficient credential for the security personnel. You saw a homeless man, and you assumed the worst. That is not ignorance, Captain. That is choice. Sloan's mouth opened and closed. No words emerged. Elias looked at him with eyes that held no anger. Only exhaustion. Only the bone-deep weariness of a man who had stopped expecting better from people a long time ago. I have been called worse, he said quietly. By better men, in places that do not exist on any map. He turned away from Sloane, dismissing him as irrelevant. What happens now, Admiral? The question was directed at Gentry, but it was Holt who answered. Now we fix this. Her voice had found its strength again. The Admiral's voice. The voice of a woman who had commanded ships and shaped policy and never backed down from a fight. 40 years is too long for the truth to stay buried. The men who saved us deserve recognition. Warren Albright deserves recognition. And you, Master Chief, deserve to have your service acknowledged by the institution you gave everything for. Gentry nodded slowly. I will need to make calls. This goes above my authority. The original classification came from levels that require presidential review to overturn. He pulled out his phone, then paused. But I know people who owe me favors. People who remember 1983 and what was done to protect secrets that stopped mattering decades ago. He met Elias's eyes. It will not happen today, but it will happen. I give him my word. Elias stared at him for a long moment. The promise of recognition after 40 years of silence. The possibility of acknowledgement after a lifetime of carrying the truth alone. It should have felt like victory, like vindication, like the moment he had unconsciously been waiting for since the day men in suits had told him his heroism had never occurred. Instead, he felt something else entirely. A crack widening in the armor he had built around himself. A fracture in the walls that had kept him functioning through decades of grief and guilt and loneliness. Warren, he whispered. His voice broke on the name. Warren should be here. He should be the one getting recognized. Not me. He is here. Holt stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm with a gentleness that seemed to surprise them both. Every person you saved carries him with them. Every life he helped preserve is his legacy. She paused, including mine. Sarah could not stay silent any longer, could not remain hidden against the wall while her father crumbled under the weight of recognition he had never expected to receive. She stepped forward. Her uniform rustled in the silence. Her footsteps echoed against the auditorium floor. And Elias Yarrow turned toward the sound and saw his daughter for the first time in 6 years. The world stopped. Every sound in the auditorium faded to nothing. Every face blurred into irrelevance. There was only Sarah, walking toward him in her dress uniform, her mother's eyes looking out from her mother's face, her rank insignia catching the overhead lights like small accusations. Lieutenant Commander. She had made Lieutenant Commander. He had watched her pin on lieutenant bars from behind a tree at the ceremony. He had not known about this promotion, had not found a way to witness it from the shadows. The realization that he had missed something, that there were pieces of her life he had not managed to follow from a distance, hit him like a physical blow. Dad. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. It was not a question, not an accusation, just a word. Just the word that every child uses to reach for their father, waited now with 6 years of silence and searching and grief. Elias could not speak. His throat had closed around everything he wanted to say. The apologies, the explanations, the desperate need to make her understand why he had left and why he had stayed away and why he had convinced himself that his absence was a gift rather than an abandonment. Sarah, her name, came out broken. Barely a whisper. The name he had spoken to himself every night in shelters and under bridges and in the quiet moments before sleep when the ghosts gathered close. Sarah. I did not. I was not going to. She closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides. Her arms wrapped around him before he could retreat, before he could disappear, before he could do what he had always done when faced with the people he loved most. She held him. And Elias Yarrow, who had descended into black water to save 47 strangers, who had watched his best friend die 3 feet away and kept functioning, who had walked away from everything he loved because he believed he was poison, shattered completely. The sound that escaped him was not human. It was the sound of 4 decades of grief and 6 years of self-imposed exile and a lifetime of carrying weights that no one should carry alone. His knees buckled. Sarah held him up. His hands gripped her uniform like a drowning man gripping a lifeline. I am sorry. The words tore out of him between sobs. "I am so sorry. I thought. I cannot. After your mother. I looked at you, and I saw her, and I cannot breathe. I cannot stay. I thought you would be better. I thought." "Stop." Sarah's voice was fierce even through her own tears. "Just stop. You do not get to apologize for being broken, Dad. You do not get to ask forgiveness for being human." She pulled back just enough to look at his face, her hands gripping his shoulders. "I have spent 6 years looking for you. 6 years checking morgues and shelters and police reports. 6 years terrified that I would get a call telling me they found your body somewhere." Her voice broke. She forced it steady again. "I thought you were dead. I thought I had lost both of my parents. And now I find out that you have been alive this whole time. That you have been carrying this impossible secret. That you saved 47 people, including the Admiral we were here to honor, and the Navy just erased you like you never existed." The others in the auditorium had retreated. Gentry had quietly gestured for everyone to give them space. Even Holt had stepped back, her own face wet with tears, watching the reunion with an expression that mingled joy and grief in equal measure. "You should have told me," Sarah whispered, "about the mission, about what they did to you, about Warren. I would have understood. I would have helped you carry it." Elias shook his head. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. "I cannot tell anyone. They made that clear." And after a while, the silence became easier than the truth. The truth was too heavy. The truth meant explaining that I watched my best friend die because I asked him to wait for me. That 47 people were alive because Warren stayed in that chamber too long. That the Navy gave him a training accident death instead of the hero's recognition he deserved. He drew a ragged breath. "Your mother knew something happened. She never pushed. She just loved me through the nightmares and the silences and the days when I could not get out of bed. And when she died, all that love went with her. And I did not know how to exist without it. I did not know how to be your father without her there to make me human." Sarah's grip on his shoulders tightened. "You were always human, Dad. You were always my father. Nothing that happened in 1983 changed that. Nothing that happened when Mom died changed that. The only thing that changed was that you stopped letting me love you." The words hit him harder than anything Sloan had said, harder than the accusations of stolen valor, harder than the decades of institutional silence. Because they were true. He had stopped letting anyone love him, had convinced himself that he was unworthy of love, that the cost of receiving it was too high when everyone he loved eventually left or died or was taken from him. "I watched you," he whispered. "I know I do not deserve credit for it, but I watched you. Your academy graduation, your commissioning, your wedding. I was there, in the back, in the shadows. I cannot stay away completely. I just could not let you see what I had become." Sarah made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. "My wedding. You were my wedding." Behind a catering truck, Elias's mouth twitched. Something that might have been a smile if smiles were still possible for him. "You look beautiful." Michael looked terrified. "Your mother would have loved every minute of it. She would have found you." Sarah's voice was certain. If she had been alive, she would have tracked you down and dragged you home by your ear and never let you leave again. "I know. That is why I waited until she was gone before I ran." He closed his eyes. "I was a coward, Sarah. I have been a coward for 6 years. The Navy called me a hero once in classified documents that no one will ever read. But the truth is I am just a broken man who did not know how to live with what he had lost." Sarah released his shoulders. Her hands moved to his face, cupping his weathered cheeks, forcing him to look at her. "Then learn," she said. Her voice was steady now, the voice of a naval officer, the voice of her mother. "You have spent 40 years carrying a mission the Navy erased. You have spent 6 years punishing yourself for being human. It is enough, Dad. It is time to come home." Home. The word hung in the air between them, a concept that had lost all meaning for Elias, a possibility he had stopped allowing himself to imagine. "I do not know how," he admitted. "I do not know how to be anything other than what I have become." Then we figured out together. Sarah wiped the tears from his face with her thumbs, the way he had once wiped tears from her face when she was small, the way her mother had wiped tears from his face on the nights when the nightmares came. "You are not alone anymore, Dad. You do not have to carry this by yourself. Not the mission, Not Warren. Not Mom. None of it. She pulled him close again, held him the way he had once held her. The way parents hold children, and children hold parents, and love holds everyone who is brave enough to let it. "Welcome home," she whispered. "Welcome home." The auditorium had taken on a different quality. The formal rigidity of a military ceremony had dissolved into something more human, more real. The remaining personnel stood in loose clusters, speaking in low voices, processing what they had witnessed. History being rewritten in real time. A ghost stepping out of classification and back into the world of the living. Fleet Admiral Gentry had moved to a corner, phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low murmur of rank and urgency and decades-old debts being called in. Whatever calls he was making, whatever wheels he was setting in motion, the intensity in his posture suggested they were significant. Admiral Holt approached Elias and Sarah slowly, giving them time to separate, to compose themselves, to transition from the raw intimacy of reunion to the formality that naval culture demanded even in moments like this. "Master Chief." Her voice was soft. "I do not want to intrude, but there is something I need to say, something I have needed to say for 40 years without knowing who to say it to." Elias straightened. The instinct was automatic. Decades of training asserting itself even now, even in a torn jacket and unwashed clothes, even with tears still drying on his face. "Mom." Holt shook her head. "No, not ma'am. Not for this." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the silver in her hair, the weight of command that sat on her shoulders like a physical thing. "I was 23 years old when the scepter went down. An ensign on my first deployment. I had been in the Navy for 18 months. I thought I knew what service meant. I thought I understood sacrifice." She paused, drew a breath. "I was wrong. I did not understand anything until I woke up in that hospital in Iceland and realized that someone had pulled me out of darkness so complete I could not see my own hands. That someone had breathed life back into lungs that had stopped working. That someone had risked everything to save a young ensign who had not yet done anything worth saving. That is not true." Elias's voice was quiet but firm. "You were worth saving the moment you raised your hand and took the oath. Every person on that submarine was worth saving. That is why we went down." Holt's eyes glistened. "I built my entire career on the foundation of that night. Every decision I made, every command I accepted, every time I pushed myself beyond what I thought possible, I did it because I knew I was living on borrowed time. Time that you gave me. Time that Warren Albright died to give me." She reached up and unclasped the gold chain from around her neck. The small cross caught the light as she held it out to him. "I want you to have this." Elias stared at the cross. The same cross he had untangled from her hair in a flooding compartment 800 meters below the surface. The same cross she had been clutching when he found her. The same cross that had somehow survived 40 years of wear, of service, of a career built on the foundation of one impossible night. "I cannot accept that," he said. "It was your grandmother's, and you saved it." Holt pressed the cross into his palm, closing his fingers around it. "You saved it, and you saved me, and you have carried the weight of that saving for 40 years without recognition, without gratitude, without even knowing if any of us survived." She held his closed fist in both of her hands. "Keep it, not as a gift, as proof. Proof that what you did mattered. Proof that Warren's death was not in vain. Proof that 47 people lived because of what you sacrificed." Elias looked down at his closed fist, at her hands wrapped around his, at the small shape of the cross pressing against his palm. "Warren would have liked you," he said finally. His voice was rough, unsteady. He always said the officers who survived the worst deployments were the ones who ended up changing the Navy. He would have been proud to know one of our extractions became an admiral. Holt smiled through her tears. "I hope I've lived up to that. I hope everything I have done has been worthy of the chance he gave me." Sarah stood beside her father, watching the exchange. Her hand rested on his arm, a grounding presence, a reminder that he was not alone anymore, that whatever came next, he would not face it in isolation. "Admiral." Gentry's voice cut across the auditorium. He had finished his calls. His face carried an expression that was difficult to read, a mixture of satisfaction and solemnity. "I have news." The remaining personnel drew closer. The air tightened with anticipation. Whatever Gentry had set in motion, it had moved faster than anyone expected. "I spoke with the Secretary of the Navy." Gentry's voice carried the weight of official pronouncement. "And with the Director of Naval Intelligence. And with 3 members of the Senate Armed Services Committee who have been waiting for 40 years for someone to finally have the courage to revisit the scepter classification." He paused. Let the silence build. "The classification is being reviewed for immediate declassification on grounds of historical significance and the expiration of relevant intelligence concerns. The Secretary has authorized a preliminary acknowledgement of the rescue operation, pending full review, and he has directed that Master Chief Petty Officer Elias Yarrow and Chief Petty Officer Warren Albright be formally recognized for their actions on April 17, 1983. The words hung in the air. 40 years of silence. 40 years of erasure. And now, in the span of a single phone call, the machinery of institutional acknowledgement had finally begun to move. The Navy cross recommendations that were buried in 1983 are being retrieved and processed. Gentry continued. "Both of them." He looked at Elias. "Yours will be presented in a formal ceremony. Warren's will be presented posthumously to his surviving family." "Warren's family." Elias's voice cracked. "His sister, Margaret, is she still alive?" Gentry nodded. "She lives in Pennsylvania. She is 81 years old. She has spent 40 years believing her brother died in a training accident." He paused. "I have already dispatched a team to inform her of the truth, to tell her that her brother died a hero, that he saved 47 lives, that his sacrifice mattered." Elias closed his eyes. The cross pressed against his palm. Warren's dog tags pressed against his chest. The weight that he had carried for 4 decades was still there. It would always be there. But somehow, impossibly, it had become lighter. "Thank you," he whispered. It was not clear if he was speaking to Gentry, or to Holt, or to Sarah, or to Warren himself. "Thank you." Gentry stepped forward and extended his hand. "No, Master Chief. Thank you. For 47 lives. For 40 years of silence that you should never have been forced to keep. And for having the courage to walk into this auditorium today and let the truth finally come to light." Elias took the hand. The grip was firm. The grip of one sailor to another. The grip of recognition and respect, and the beginning of a debt being repaid. Captain Sloan watched from the periphery. His face had gone gray. The full magnitude of his mistake was still unfolding, each new revelation adding another layer to his humiliation. He had tried to remove a hero. He had mocked a legend. And now he stood witness to the moment when the Navy finally acknowledged what he had attempted to dismiss as delusion. No one looked at him. No one needed to. His irrelevance was its own punishment. The auditorium doors opened, and a young lieutenant entered with a tablet in his hands and urgency in his stride. He crossed directly to Gentry and spoke in low tones, showing him something on the screen. Gentry's expression shifted. Something between concern and grim satisfaction. "It seems," Gentry announced to the room, "that our situation has become more complicated." He turned the tablet so others could see. Captain Sloan's confrontation with Master Chief Yarrow was captured on video by a guest before the room was cleared. It has been uploaded to social media. As of 5 minutes ago, it has been viewed over 200,000 times. The blood drained from Sloan's face. He stepped forward, his voice strangled. "Admiral, I can explain. I was following protocol. I had no way of knowing who he was. The optics of a homeless individual disrupting a formal ceremony demanded immediate action." Gentry held up a hand. "The optics, Captain, show a naval officer publicly humiliating an elderly veteran based on his appearance. They show you accusing a decorated rescue diver of stolen valor. They show you grabbing the arm of a man who saved 47 American sailors, including the Admiral whose retirement we were gathered to celebrate." He lowered the tablet. "The optics, Captain Sloan, are catastrophic." Sloan's mouth opened and closed. The career he had spent 30 years building was crumbling in real time. Every connection he had cultivated, every favor he had accumulated, every careful step up the ladder of naval advancement meant nothing now. The video would define him. The video would follow him forever. Sir, his voice had gone thin. Desperate. I request the opportunity to personally apologize to Master Chief Yarrow. To make this right, whatever it takes. Elias looked at him. The man who had called him a vagrant, who had accused him of stolen valor, who had grabbed his arm and tried to physically remove him from a building he had more right to occupy than anyone else present. There should have been anger, should have been satisfaction at watching Sloane's world collapse. But Elias felt only exhaustion, only the hollow recognition that Sloane was simply another symptom of a system that had been failing veterans since long before 1983. I do not need your apology, Captain. Elias's voice was quiet. Even, I needed you to ask before you assumed. I needed you to see a man before you saw a problem. But that moment is gone. No apology changes what you showed everyone in this room about who you are. Sloane flinched as if struck. What happens to him is not my concern, Elias continued. He looked at Gentry. I did not come here for revenge. I did not come here for recognition. I came here because I read about this ceremony in the newspaper, and I saw Admiral Holt's name, and I needed to know if she had survived. That is all. Everything else that happened today was not part of any plan. Gentry studied him for a long moment. Then what do you want, Master Chief? After 40 years of silence, after everything that was taken from you, what do you actually want? The question hung in the air. Simple words demanding a complex answer. What do you want? He had stopped wanting things years ago, had trained himself to need nothing beyond the next meal. The next shelter, the next day, survived. Wanting was dangerous. Wanting meant hoping. And hope, for Elias Yarrow, had been a luxury he could not afford. Sarah's hand found his. Squeezed. A reminder that things had changed. That the walls he had built were already crumbling. That whether he wanted it or not, he was no longer alone. I want Warren's name cleared. The words came slowly, pulled from somewhere deep. I want his sister to know that her brother was a hero. I want the 5 sailors we could not save to be remembered as casualties of a rescue mission, not equipment failure. I want the 47 people we pulled out of that submarine to know who saved them and what it cost. He paused. His hand tightened around the cross Holt had given him. And I want to stop running. His voice cracked. I want to learn how to be a father again. I want to visit my wife's grave and tell her that I am sorry it took me so long to come home. I want to sit at a table with my daughter and her husband and eat a meal like a human being instead of a ghost. Sarah made a small sound beside him. Her grip on his hand became almost painful. I want to matter again, Elias whispered. Not because of what I did 40 years ago, but because of what I might still do with whatever time I have left. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. This one held possibility. This one held the fragile beginnings of something that might, with care and time and patience, grow into healing. Admiral Holt stepped forward. You matter, Master Chief. You have always mattered. The Navy's failure to acknowledge that does not change the truth of it. She gestured to the room. Everyone standing here knows what you did. Everyone who watches that video will know. And when the declassification is complete, the whole world will know. She placed her hand over his, over Sarah's, over the small gold cross pressed against his palm. War knew, she said softly. In that decompression chamber, in those final moments, he knew that what you accomplished together would outlast both of you. He told you to get them home. And you did. 47 times over, you did. Elias closed his eyes. The tears came again. He had cried more today than in the entire 6 years since he had left. The dam had broken, and everything behind it was flooding out. I talked to him, he admitted. His voice was barely audible. Every day, I tell him what I see, where I am, how many veterans I meet on the streets who remind me of him. I tell him I'm sorry. I tell him I should have been faster, should have surfaced sooner, should have been the one in that chamber instead of him. He opened his eyes, looked at Holt, looked at his daughter, looked at the small group of naval officers who had witnessed his unraveling. He never answers, Elias said. But I keep talking anyway, because the day I stop talking to Warren is the day I finally give up. and he told me to get them home. So I cannot give up. I have to keep trying. For him. Sarah pulled him close, held him the way she had held him before, the way she would hold him again and again in the days and weeks and years to come. Then keep trying, she whispered. Keep talking to him, and let us help you carry the weight. That is what family does, Dad. That is what Warren would have wanted. Outside the auditorium, the world was already changing. The video was spreading. The story was growing. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, an 80-year-old woman was about to learn that her brother had not died in a training accident. He had died a hero, and the world was finally going to know his name. The formal acknowledgement came 3 hours later in a conference room adjacent to the auditorium. The space had been swept for recording devices, secured by personnel whose clearances exceeded everyone else in the building, and arranged with the kind of urgent efficiency that only the military could achieve on short notice. Elias sat at a long table with Sarah on one side and Admiral Holt on the other. Across from him sat Fleet Admiral Gentry, 2 representatives from Naval Intelligence, a JAG officer whose job was to navigate the legal complexities of declassifying a 40-year-old operation, and a Navy historian who had been pulled from the archives with barely enough time to review the original mission files. The historian, a commander named Patricia Webb, had arrived with a box of documents that had not seen light since 1983. Her hands had trembled as she opened it. Her voice had trembled more as she began reading the contents aloud. Operation Depth Siren, she said. April 17, 1983. USS Scepter, operating under classified orders in the North Atlantic, experienced catastrophic hull failure at 0312 hours. 52 crew members aboard. Distress signal received by support vessel USS Providence at 0347. Rescue operation initiated immediately. She turned a page. The paper was yellowed. The ink was fading, but the words remained. Rescue team consisted of 2 divers. Master Chief Petty Officer Elias Yarrow, call sign Depth Charge. Chief Petty Officer Warren Albright, call sign Iron Lung. Descent initiated at 0423. Depth of operation, 847 meters. Conditions, near zero visibility. Water temperature, 2.3 degrees Celsius. Structural integrity of target vessel compromised. Commander Webb paused. Looked Elias. Looked back at the documents. Extraction commenced at 0441. Over the following 8 hours, the dive team extracted 47 survivors from the disabled submarine through a breach in the forward hull. 5 crew members were found deceased in flooded compartments. Cause of death, drowning due to initial hull failure. She turned another page. Her voice had grown quieter. At 1,247 hours, Chief Petty Officer Albright experienced decompression failure while manning the ascent station. Equipment malfunction caused catastrophic pressure differential. CPO Albright died at 1,251 hours. His final communication, recorded by shipboard systems, consisted of 3 words directed at Master Chief Yarrow. She stopped. The room was silent. Get them home. Elias stared at the table. His hand had found the dog tags beneath his shirt. 2 sets of metal pressing against his chest. His own name and Warren's name hanging together the way they had hung together for 40 years. The mission was classified immediately upon completion. Commander Webb continued. All participants were debriefed and instructed to maintain permanent silence regarding the operation. Service records were amended to remove any reference to the Scepter rescue. CPO Albright's death was officially attributed to a training accident at a stateside facility. Recommendations for Navy Cross awards for both divers were filed and subsequently sealed. She closed the folder. Until today, this operation did not exist. These men did not exist. The 47 people they saved were officially rescued by standard naval response teams that arrived after the fact. She looked around the room. The people in this room are the first to hear the truth spoken aloud in 4 decades. The silence that followed was absolute. The weight of institutional betrayal pressing down on everyone present. The magnitude of what had been hidden and what had been lost and what might now, finally, be recovered. Gentry spoke first. The declassification process will take time. Months, potentially. There are intelligence implications that need to be addressed, diplomatic sensitivities that need to be managed, legal frameworks that need to be established. But I have assurances from the Secretary that this will happen. The full story will be told. He looked at Elias. In the meantime, the Navy is prepared to issue a preliminary acknowledgement of your service and CPO Albright sacrifice. A formal statement recognizing the existence of the operation and the heroism of its participants. It will not be the full recognition you deserve, but it will be a start. Elias nodded slowly. The words washed over him without fully penetrating. 40 years. 40 years of silence. And suddenly the dam was breaking, and he did not know how to process the flood. What about Warren's sister? His voice was hoarse. Margaret, does she know yet? Gentry's expression softened. A team reached her an hour ago. She has been informed of the true circumstances of her brother's death. He paused. She asked to speak with you. When you are ready. She said she has waited 40 years to thank the man who was with Warren when he died. The sound that escaped Elias was something between a laugh and a sob. He pressed his palm against his eyes. His shoulders shook. Sarah's hand found his back. Steady, present, anchoring him to a reality that had shifted so dramatically in the space of a single afternoon that he could barely recognize it. Admiral Holt leaned forward. Master Chief, I know this is overwhelming. I know you came here today expecting nothing more than a glimpse of a ceremony from the back row. But what you have set in motion cannot be undone. The truth is out. The acknowledgement is coming. And whether you wanted it or not, you are about to become very visible. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The Navy failed you, she said. I cannot undo that failure. No one can. But I can promise you that from this moment forward, you will have advocates. You will have support. You will have people fighting to ensure that what was taken from you is restored as fully as possible. She squeezed his hand. And you will have my personal commitment to honoring Warren's memory. His name will be spoken at every ceremony I attend for the rest of my life. His sacrifice will be part of my story because it is part of my story. I would not be here without him. None of the 47 would be here without him. Elias lifted his head. His eyes were red. His face was wet. But something had changed in his expression, something that looked almost like peace. He would have been embarrassed, he said quietly. Warren, he hated attention, hated ceremonies. He used to say the best divers were the ones nobody remembered because remembering meant something went wrong. Holt smiled through her own tears. Then we will remember him quietly, in our own ways, every day for the rest of our lives. The JAG officer cleared his throat. There are practical matters to discuss, Master Chief. Compensation for the years of service that were effectively erased from your record. Medical benefits. Housing assistance. The Navy has resources available for situations like this, and given the circumstances, I expect those resources will be made available to you immediately. Resources. Housing. Benefits. Words that belonged to a life Elias had stopped living years ago. A life he had convinced himself he would never return to. Sarah spoke before he could respond. You'll be staying with me. Her voice left no room for argument. Whatever the Navy provides will be appreciated, but he has a home. He has had one all along. He just forgot where to find it. Elias looked at his daughter, at the steel in her eyes, at the love beneath the steel, at the woman she had become while he watched from shadows and convinced himself he was protecting her by staying away. Okay, he whispered. The word was small, simple, the most difficult word he had spoken in 40 years. Okay. The sun was setting over Norfolk when they finally emerged from the building. Orange light spilled across the base, painting everything in shades of fire and gold. Elias stood on the steps and breathed air that tasted different than it had that morning. Cleaner somehow, lighter. Sarah stood beside him. She had not left his side since the reunion, had not let go of his arm or his hand or some point of contact that reminded them both that this was real, that neither of them was dreaming. A Navy sedan waited at the curb, driver standing at attention, doors open, ready to take them wherever they needed to go. Where to? Sarah asked softly. Elias was quiet for a long moment. The question contained multitudes. Where to tonight? Where to tomorrow? Where to for the rest of a life he had stopped planning years ago. Your mother, he said finally. I need to see her. I need to tell her I am coming home. Sarah's breath caught. She nodded. Squeeze his arm. We can go now. The cemetery is 20 minutes from here. They rode in silence through streets that Elias half recognized from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Strip malls and housing developments and the slow sprawl of a naval town that had grown and changed while he wandered through it like a ghost. He had walked these roads, had slept in doorways within sight of the base gates, had watched sailors in uniform pass by without seeing him, without knowing that he had once worn the same uniform, had once belonged to the same institution that now rushed to acknowledge what it had spent 40 years denying. The cemetery was quiet in the evening light. Rows of headstones stretched across manicured grass, each one marking a life completed, a story ended, a space left behind in the world. Sarah led him along paths she clearly knew well, paths she had walked many times in the years since her mother died. They stopped before a simple stone, white marble, Navy standard for dependents of service members. The inscription read, Nora Elizabeth Yarrow, beloved wife and mother, 195-42018, rest in grace. Elias sank to his knees. The grass was soft beneath him. The stone was cool when he pressed his palm against it. He had not been here since the funeral, had not been able to face this place, this proof, this permanent marker of everything he had lost. Hey, Nora. His voice cracked. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry for a lot of things. Sarah stood behind him, close enough to touch, far enough to give him space, the way her mother would have stood, the way love stands when it knows that presence matters more than words. I found Sarah, Elias continued. Where she found me. I'm not sure which. Does it matter? He laughed softly, a broken sound. You always said I was stubborn, said I would rather drown than ask for help. You were right. You were always right. He traced the letters of her name with his finger. The N, the O, the R, the A, for letters that had meant home for 30 years. The Navy is finally talking, he said, about the scepter, about Warren, about what we did. They're going to give us medals, Nora. 40 years late, but they're going to do it. He paused. I wish you could be there. I wish you could see it. You always believed it would happen someday. You always said the truth finds a way. The evening breeze stirred the trees overhead. Leaves rustled. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out and fell silent. Sarah is taking me home, Elias whispered. To her house. She says I have a room there. She says I have always had a room there, even when I was too broken to use it. His voice dropped lower. She is so much like you. Strong, stubborn, refuses to give up on people even when they give up on themselves. He pressed his forehead against the cool stone. I'm going to try, Nora. I'm going to try to be the man you married, the father Sarah deserves. I do not know if I can do it. I do not know if there is enough left of me to rebuild. But I'm going to try. For you. For her. For Warren. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the grass, forehead against marble, letting the grief flow through him without fighting it, without running from it. For the first time in 6 years, staying still instead of walking away. Sarah's hand touched his shoulder. Dad, whenever you are ready. Elias lifted his head, wiped his face with the back of his hand, looked at the headstone one more time. I will come back, he said to the stone. To Nora, to the memory of everything they had built together. I will come back and tell you how it goes. Every week. I promise. He rose slowly. His knees protested. His body ached in ways that had nothing to do with age. But he stood, and he turned, and he looked at his daughter with eyes that held something they had not held in years. Hope. Let's go home, he said. Sarah smiled, took his hand, led him back down the path toward the waiting car. Behind them, the last light of sunset painted Nora's headstone in shades of gold. The breeze stirred the grass. And somewhere, somehow, in the way that love persists beyond death and distance, and all the walls we build against it, Elias felt certain that Nora was smiling too. The drive to Sarah's house took 30 minutes. A modest home in a neighborhood of other modest homes, filled with other military families living other military lives. Michael, Sarah's husband, stood on the porch waiting. He had been briefed by phone. He had watched the viral video like millions of others. And when Elias stepped out of the car, Michael walked down the steps and extended his hand. "Welcome home, sir," he said. "It is an honor." Elias took the hand, gripped it, looked at the man his daughter had married, the man he had watched from behind a catering truck, the man who had become family while Elias was busy being a ghost. "Thank you for taking care of her," Elias said quietly. "When I could not." Michael shook his head. "She took care of herself, sir. She is the strongest person I have ever known." He paused. "But she never stopped hoping you would come back. She never stopped believing." Sarah appeared beside them, took both their hands, drew them toward the door. "Enough standing outside," she said. Her voice was thick but steady. "There is dinner waiting, in a room that has been ready for 6 years, and a family that finally has everyone home." Elias let himself be led, through the door, into the warmth, into the light, into a future he had stopped believing was possible. Home. 3 months later, Elias stood in a different auditorium. This one was in Washington. This one was filled with people who had come specifically to see him. This one held the weight of history being corrected in real time. The Navy Cross hung heavy against his chest. The ribbon was new, but the honor was 40 years old, finally pulled from the classified files where it had been buried and presented in a ceremony attended by the Secretary of the Navy, 3 sitting admirals, 42 of the 47 survivors of the scepter, and one 80-year-old woman who had flown from Pennsylvania to see her brother's sacrifice acknowledged at last. Margaret Albright sat in the front row. Her hair was white and her hands were frail, but her eyes were sharp and her spine was straight. She wore Warren's Navy Cross on a chain around her neck, presented to her an hour earlier in a private ceremony that had left everyone in the room in tears. 40 years of believing her brother died in a meaningless training accident. 40 years of grief without context. And now, finally the truth. Elias had spoken with her the night before, had told her everything. The dive, the rescues, the decompression chamber, Warren's hand against the glass. The 3 words that had kept Elias alive through 4 decades of silence. "He was the best of us," Elias had told her. "He stayed in that chamber because I asked him to, because I kept going back down, and he kept waiting for me to surface. He died because he refused to leave his post. He died a hero." Margaret had taken his hands in hers. Her grip was stronger than he expected. "He wrote me letters," she had said, "from every deployment. He always talked about you. Said you were the only person he trusted to watch his back. Said if anything ever happened to him, he hoped you would be the one beside him." She had smiled through her tears. "He got his wish," she had said, "and now I know he did not die alone. Thank you for being there. Thank you for carrying him all these years." Now, Elias stood at the podium, looking out at faces he recognized and faces he did not. Sarah sat beside Michael in the second row. Admiral Holt sat in the front, wearing her grandmother's cross, which Elias had returned to her the week after the ceremony in Norfolk. She had tried to refuse. He had insisted. "It belongs with you," he had told her. "You are the proof that it mattered." The room fell silent as he prepared to speak. The words he had written the night before suddenly seemed inadequate. How do you summarize 40 years of silence? How do you explain what it means to be erased and then restored? How do you honor a friend who died saving strangers and was denied recognition until everyone who made that decision was already gone? He cleared his throat, gripped the podium, and spoke. "I'm not good at speeches," he began. Warren was the talker. He could make anyone laugh, even 800 meters down in water, so cold it hurt to breathe. He would have hated this. All the attention, all the ceremony. He would have told me to shut up and let everyone get to the food. Soft laughter rippled through the audience. Margaret smiled through fresh tears. "But he is not here to tell me that," Elias continued. "So I'm going to say what needs to be said. Not for me. For him. For the 47 people in this room who survived because Warren Albright refused to leave his post. For the families of the 5 who did not survive, who deserve to know their loved ones were casualties of a rescue mission, not an accident." He paused, drew a breath. The Navy made a choice 40 years ago. They chose secrecy over truth. They chose institutional protection over individual recognition. I understood why. I did not agree, but I understood. What I did not understand was why it had to last so long. Why Warren's sister had to spend 4 decades believing a lie. Why the people we saved had to live without knowing who to thank or who to mourn. He looked at Margaret. That ends today. Warren Albright was my best friend. He was the finest diver I ever knew. And he died because he cared more about bringing people home than he cared about his own survival. His name deserves to be spoken. His sacrifice deserves to be remembered. And I will spend whatever time I have left making sure that happens. He turned back to the audience. To the survivors of the scepter, you do not owe me anything. You do not owe Warren anything. You survived. You lived your lives. You raised families and served your country and became the people you were meant to become. That is the only payment we ever wanted. That is the only recognition that matters. His voice dropped lower. To my daughter Sarah, who never stopped searching for me even when I did everything I could to stay lost. Thank you. Thank you for refusing to give up. Thank you for bringing me home. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you have become. I know I am. Sarah wiped her eyes. Michael put his arm around her. And to Warren, Elias looked up, as if addressing someone beyond the ceiling, beyond the building, beyond the boundaries of the living world. I kept my promise, brother. I got them home, all 47 of them. And now I'm home too. Finally, after all these years. He stepped back from the podium. The silence held for a moment. Then Admiral Holt rose to her feet. Then Margaret. Then the survivors, one by one, standing in recognition of the man who had carried their lives in his hands and their secret in his heart for 40 years. The applause was not loud. It did not need to be. It was something deeper than noise, something that resonated in chests and caught in throats and said everything that words could not. Elias returned to his seat beside Sarah. She took his hand, held it tight. Warren would have hated this, she whispered. Elias smiled. The first real smile in longer than he could remember. Yeah, he said. He really would have. But he would have been proud too. Proud of the lives saved. Proud of the truth finally told. Proud of his best friend, standing in the light at last. No longer a ghost. No longer running. No longer alone. Still here, brother, Elias whispered. Still trying. And this time, finally, the trying felt like enough. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in forms we might not recognize, please subscribe to this channel. These stories matter. These men and women matter. And sometimes the greatest courage is not to dive into darkness, but the choice to come back into the light. Thank you for watching. And remember, the next time you see someone the world has overlooked, take a moment to ask before you assume. You never know whose hand once held the line between life and death. You never know whose silence is protecting a truth the world was not ready to hear.